If you're into trains and history and that sort of thing, then I've got a treat for you. Today we're going to be having a look around the Bassendean Rail and Heritage Museum, and I'm going to be chatting to a couple of people on the process of maintaining one of these type of museums. So sit back and let's get into it. The museum is home to an impressive collection of locomotives, carriages and rail memorabilia, all telling the story of how rail shaped Western Australia. Some of these locomotives date back over 100 years, and many have been carefully restored by dedicated volunteers. Now I'm joined today by Graham, who is one of the staff members here at the museum. Thanks for letting me come in and do a bit of filming around here today. Can I ask first, how did the museum first come about to be here? What's its story?
Well, it came about when mainly after the transition from steam to diesel, going back, we just had our 50th anniversary here at the museum. So going back well over 50 years ago, it was first mooted that we'd preserve, or the society should preserve, the steam relics and the old style carriages and wagons for future generations.
There's such a rich history of rail in Western Australia. What would you say is the most significant pieces in your collection?
Definitely the steam engines. I mean, that's something that the younger generation would have had no practical exposure to in working form. We've got an amazing range of steam locomotives here in a static form. One of them has just been restored in the last couple of years. Initially it was going to be for a hired special project in the country out from Darwin. That project fell away, and we acquired the locomotive back here in the for the display here at the museum, and that's currently still certified for steam. But we, because of the current restrictions, we can't operate that on a main line anywhere. So it's basically a static display item, which gives the general public a very good idea of what used to be involved in operating trains with steam engines.
I'm curious though, what was the project at Darwin that they were looking at doing?
They were going to operate a train from Darwin to Walketcham, and I think back to Gamelling. It was a joint venture between the city, the Shire of Darwin, and Rail Heritage WA. I'm not sure why it wasn't achieved, but we finished up withdrawing from that project with the agreement from the city of Darwin. They were the main finances for the project. So we reclaimed a lot of our heritage items, and in fact we've still got an involvement with what was going to be the depot at a small siding east of Darwin called Minivale. It was an old
Yes, I know that.
CBH wind bin, which the Shire had obtained lease of, and that was set up to be the depot for the hired special picnic train. But as I say, unfortunately, it didn't proceed. But we still have involvement with it. We've got items up there on display as a regional museum. It's occasionally open to the public. Fairly isolated, but that makes it even more interesting to visitors coming to see what is on display there.
So a lot of people might not realise just how important rail was to West Australia's development. How did it shape the state and the economy in towns?
Well, railways were actually built in a lot of areas to open up the countryside for farming in the first instance, and was very successful way back in the late 1800s. Railway lines were actually built to provide an incentive for people to take up land around the railway line, so they can transport their product to market, and that. Goods were restricted to rail for many, many years. It was way about 1970 before that became before that was eased by government policy to allow road transport to take over. And but railways certainly developed the countryside with small sidings about every 7 or 8 kilometres. They tell me that the main reason for that was the distance for a horse and cart transport to the siding, so people could pick up their goods or transport their grain or farm products back to market.
Now, this is just my opinion, but when you look around the rest of Australia at all the tourist railways that are still running, especially using steam trains, and then look at the lack of anything in Western Australia, not including what Hotham Valley does, if it was possible to improve rail heritage here in WA, what would you personally like to see come back?
Well, practically the only operation I can see is a dedicated section of unused track that's in good condition and heavily financed hopefully by the government, to make it purely a tourist railway line, a short distance, only 10 or 15 k's at the very most. But I just can't see it happening. The costs would be prohibitive. There's no way that we would ever be allowed to run on suburban rail with the density of suburban trains at the moment. For example, in Bayswater, a train about every 3 minutes. So there's no way you could operate a heritage train to the city in amongst that lot. It would be just purely impossible.
So how do you find items that end up in the museum? How do they come to you?
Well, most of the objects that we've got here now have been here for many years. We still get the occasional smaller product. Somebody's grandfather dies and you find all his equipment, and the family will want to donate it to the museum because they no longer require it. Granddad's passed away and that sort of thing. We get many donations of that type. Large items are very rare for any larger items to be donated because we've already acquired most of it that are available. Occasionally we might get something, but it's very rare nowadays.
So these wagons, though, how did you come across these wagons? How did they come to be here?
Well, most of the rolling stock, as I call it, the goods wagons and the coaching stock, which is passenger coaches, was redundant with the government railway, with the former West Rail. When they were easing out of that type of traffic, they donated it to or made it available, still under government ownership, to the museum for heritage display. That would have been where the vast majority of the larger product come from, via the former state government railway, West Rail.
So what got you into being a volunteer here at the museum?
Well, I had a background in rail, and I left school at a very young age, and was employed by the railways for just on 40 years. And after a period of semi-retirement jobs, I had time on my hands, so I elected to come to the Railway Museum because I'm still very interested in the history of railways in Western Australia, having worked for the railways. And that would be going back 7 or 8 years now that I've been here as a volunteer.
So if somebody wanted to get involved and maybe volunteer or support the museum some way, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best if they personally come in and inquire at the counter on our open days, which is Sunday afternoon and Wednesday afternoon. They can apply via the internet. There's a site on the web that would allow them to make an application via email. But I usually handle the inquiries via email and ask them to pop into the museum and have a look for themselves and see what it is that would interest them, and we could encourage them to join the organisation. And it does certainly help to keep up our numbers. Volunteers in any organisation are at times difficult to obtain, and it's a constant issue for us to maintain volunteers. But it's certainly an interesting role, of particularly if somebody's got an avid interest in rail operations, or the history of rail operations, more to the point, which is what we have here. There's a whole range of jobs they could be employed on, whether it be just general cleaning, maintenance of existing exhibits, or actually reconstructing or rebuilding some of the very old exhibits we have that are certainly in need of restoration.
Do they have to have any kind of rail experience to come here?
No, we have many people that don't have any rail background at all. You get people that are very keen tradesmen. Perhaps they're retired, semi-retired, and they've got time on their hands. They come along and they're extremely valuable. We've had many projects just in the last 12 months with a couple of very qualified tradespeople have contributed enormously and saved a lot of money in developing some of the items that needed attention around the museum.
Now, I believe you've got the steam engine here that was dubbed the Rescue Special in 1907. Can we go and have a look at that?
Yes, certainly. So it's not too far away.
Regular viewers may recall a few years ago I talked about a train that was involved in a mine rescue in Coolgardie. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link up in the top right hand corner and at the end of this video to that video. But this is the engine that set the world record for steam over the distance of 560 kilometres.
Well, the miner was trapped underground in a fairly deep gold mine in Kalgoorlie way back in around about 1907, I think it was. And he was trapped, the water was had cut off, but he had capacity to for breathing, but they couldn't leach him. They couldn't rescue him locally, so they had to get some divers from Fremantle. So this locomotive was organised to run the scratch and train with the divers through to Coolgardie, which was nearby the deep underground mine where this chap was trapped. It would have got there in record time. I forget how long it took to get there, but it was a record time for that time. So we're talking about way back in 1907, 1908. And don't forget, it would have had to have stopped about every 50 kilometres to take water and replenish the coal at some stage on the journey. So they did very well to get there, and the miner was successfully rescued. The locomotive itself's got quite a history. Used on many passenger services in its initial days. It was probably built in around about very late 1800s. It's only 7 or 8 years old when it did the run to Coolgardie. When it finished its functional life with on the freight trains and the passenger trains, it was restored at Midland workshops and put on display. I think it was outside the Railway Institute at the Midland workshops initially, and then it was transferred over to the Centre Point shopping centre. It was there for many, many years at the Centre Point shopping centre, which at the time was a major intersection of Great Eastern Highway in Midland. It was a main road through to the workshops. It was an unusual crossing. I can recall that as a young kid myself. The traffic that used to go through that particular intersection without traffic lights, with in peak hour with a flag duties in the centre of the intersection. But anyway, when the Midland was being redeveloped, a locomotive was deemed to be in the way at the shopping centre, so it was relocated back here to the museum.
There are several steam locomotives scattered throughout the yard, each in varying condition, and each one of them has its own story to tell, just like this one.
This is the last mainline steam engine to be used by the WAGR, or West Rail as it became known as later. About 1972, I think was its last one. Only operated for very short period because of the introduction of diesel locomotives. These were only in use for about 15 to 20 years, which is a very short period for a steam locomotive. Some of them went for nearly 100 years. It's a very powerful locomotive and quite popular with the drivers. You'd still require on a heavily loaded freight train. 2 of these would be required to go up over the Darling Range and through to Northern. What's very common on their last trips was between Midland and Northern with heavy loads of say superphosphate on the outwards run. Coming back from Northern, it wasn't so heavier grade, so one locomotive could handle the load quite easily. And certainly on the way up if we over the Darling Range, needed 2 on a full load. So they were very popular and very handy locomotives.
Have a look at how tall these things are. This is where the workers would be walking on. And the size of the wheels. And when you think these were built, I don't know, what do you say, 100 years ago? Amazing what they did in those days. Now here's something you might not have known. I only found this out myself a few months ago. I always thought the wagon behind the engine was just for carrying coal. But it turns out the coal sits in the middle and most of the wagons actually filled with water.
This is the S-Class locomotive. These were introduced around about 1947, and actually, like always, the old story of bigger and better than all the previous locomotives that the government railways had. This particular one was actually refurbished and restored to use for a picnic train to operate out of Dowra, and unfortunately that joint venture we had with the Shire of Dowra fell through some time ago. So the locomotives was returned here to ownership of the Railway Historical Society, and actually of course towed back from Dowra, and that was the last time it was used on the main line. We're not permitted now to use these locomotives on the main line. This particular one is still certified for steam, but unfortunately that's quite an expensive operation to maintain that certification if not being used, and of course we can't use it. The only time we use it is on open days, running up and down over about 200 metres out the back to show the general public what a steam engine can do. But because of the cost of maintaining the certification and no income being generated from it, we're going to have to let the certification lapse very shortly, and it'll be open for public in steam for those short trips for the last time on around about on the 15th of March. It'll be running up and down our track out the back here, and for the last time before it gets mothballed and at this stage maintained as a static exhibition for the general public. Probably get a fresh coat of paint to brighten it up a bit, but unfortunately it won't be operating again after March this year at this stage, unless somebody comes along with a more economic, innovative idea that we can use.
Steam engines ruled the railways for decades, but as technology advanced, a new era arrived. It was out with the coal and water and in with the diesel fuel and efficiency. Let's take a look at a locomotive that took over when steam made way for diesel.
This is a XA locomotive. It's an enhancement on the original X-Class locomotive that was introduced in around about the late 1940s The initial X-class locomotive had to operate as a single unit. So if you wanted to increase the load of a train, you had to have 2 X-class locomotives and 2 crews. They developed this XA unit that enabled 2 units to be coupled together. And this was the first of the WA diesel locomotives that were able to be multi-coupled and operated by 1 crew. And of course, on the industrial relations side, the driver and the fireman got an allowance for operating 2 locomotives on the 1 train. And it even relates back to the old telegraph days. The code word for the multi-unit allowance was AXMO. And I can remember as a young fellow on timesheets endorsing that all the time on the crew's timesheet, AXMO allowance. The fireman, as I recall, with the second man in the locomotive, used to have to go through from one locomotive to the rear locomotive and take down oil pressure readings and things like that. They eventually eliminated that and were able to check the readings from the front locomotive.
But it's not just engines here at the museum. There are loads of different types of wagons. How about the one that used to carry gold from Kalgoorlie to Perth? For 40 years this wagon rattled down the tracks with 2 guards locked inside transporting gold. They weren't let out until they arrived in Perth. With no way in or out during the journey, the guards had to be completely self-contained, in every way. How about riding the train to the city in one of these in the 60s and 70s? If you went to Bunbury on the train, then you might remember this one.
This was the Australian buffet car, and would have operated until around about probably I suppose 1980. It was replaced by the diesel rail cars that operated for quite a few years down to Bunbury. This Australian car would have been mainly on the Australind Express between Perth and Bunbury, and also went to Albany on different occasions. Main product was sandwiches and pies and pasties. The railway pies had a very famous reputation. They were made in Welshpool and provided to refreshment outlets that the railways had all over the state, including this Australian coach. And it's now here at our museum and very popular with young children for birthday parties. Probably every 2 or 3 weeks we'd have a request for a party on a Wednesday or a Sunday afternoon, and the kids just absolutely love sitting in around these tables here and having their little snacks that they brought along for their birthday party.
You know, I can remember when I was a kid, I'd gone down to gone down to Bunbury a couple of times on the train, and these were the carriages that we were in. I can always remember wanting to go into the buffet car because it was an interesting place to look at, you know, and because back then the windows opened up, you could stick your head out the window, and if it was a steam train then you had that smell of the steam coming past. Yeah, it was brilliant. I always loved going down there on these things. And it wasn't just the locals that took the train to Bunbury. Hidden amongst all this rolling stock is even a royal wagon. The Queen Mother used it in 1966 to go to Bunbury. Take a walk inside and see how train travel for royalty looked. Built in 1955, this rail car was the last wooden-bodied wagon to come out of the Midland Rail workshops. Inside, it featured a fit-out reflecting the latest trends of the 1950s. Back in the day, if you had a little bit of money and wanted to travel with a bit more comfort and privacy, you could move up from cattle class and travel in second class. During the day, these compartments provided a comfortable place to sit and watch the countryside roll by. But at night, the seats folded down into beds, turning the space into a cosy sleeping area for the journey ahead. No train could ever reach its destination without the men in the signal box. They were the unsung heroes of the railway, keeping everything running safely and smoothly, one signal at a time.
This is a common signal box that was used in the metropolitan area. Every few kilometres one of these would be available to break up the section. Back in the earlier days was purely a manual system. Well, this particular one is here at Bassendean. There's one up at the main station at Bassendean, only 4 or 5 kilometres away. So a train would leave Bassendean, the signal mark there would indicate by a bell code that a train was coming. I would clear this instrument here to allow the train to come through. These levers, I'd pull off the signals indicating the train was okay to go from through Ashfield onto Perth. The black levers are point levers on the diagram. We've got a switch over from one track to another, and then I would indicate to the next signalman down at Bayswater that a train is approaching his station, and that was how we controlled the separation of trains going through the metropolitan area. Bear in mind there was 2 tracks, one up to Perth and one down from Perth to through Ashfield, or Bassendean as it's called nowadays. And the other instruments are separate again. This instrument here is for country areas, called an electric staff instrument. That was on single line tracks, so you had to have authority to go into the section on a single line to avoid the confrontation of a train coming from the other direction. So you had to have authority by one of these staffs out of the instrument, which locked the instrument at the other end of the siding, and made it very safe for the trains to proceed through a single line track. And that was used for well over 100 years, probably a bit longer than that, probably 150 years. Very, very good system, and now replaced of course by modern day methods of train orders that are actually computerised. So that's what used to happen up until probably 40 years ago.
So can you explain a little bit about just how this actually worked?
Yeah, this is a safe working method used on single line tracks. Now I'm old enough to remember this particular section that this one controlled. It's Mungary to West Kalgoorlie. Mungary is approximately halfway between West Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie. Now this controlled the section on the single line to prevent more than one train being in the section at any one time. The driver would have to have a staff. That instrument would have about 20 staffs in it, but you'd only get one out at a time. So I would draw the staff out, roll it back out of there. If there's no other staff being withdrawn at the other end, I can get that staff out. And that would allow the train that I've got at West Kalgoorlie to proceed with safety to the station at the other end of the section, which is a siding called Mungary, which is halfway between Kalgoorlie and West Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie. And that was a system that was used for many, many years, probably towards 150 years, and a very good system.
So the train driver physically did this himself?
No, it could at an unattended siding the train driver would do it himself, or at an attended siding the station master or the duty officer would do it.
First class accommodation is at the rear of the train.
There's so much to see here and we've only just scratched the surface. While the displays are impressive, it's the dedicated people behind the scenes who make a museum like this possible. To get a better idea about the restoration process, I spoke to Rhys about what it takes to bring these machines back to life. So Rhys, what are some of the biggest challenges you face when restoring locomotives and rail cars?
The biggest challenges would be finding the time and the people to do it, as well as sourcing the materials and finding out what is wrong with an issue, with the object to restore it to a safe manner.
So can you walk us through some of the steps you take in a restoration process, say like on something like this?
So with a project like this, we would typically look at it physically to try and see with the expertise that we have of what issues that we might find within the restoration project. Then we would source documents and plans and drawings from typically online or archival sources, which will help us to do this project. And then we'd go through the steps of finding the materials, finding the resources and the time to actually partake in this project, and then we prioritise big issues and then we start doing more manual and cosmetic issues afterwards. And it can take within a couple of months to many years to actually complete a project. And for something like this, it would take at least over a year.
So when you come across parts that are severely damaged or just a bit non-existent, do you make them in-house or do you outsource that sort of thing?
It varies case by case, but so it depends on the severity of the damaged part. But most of the time we try and use the resources we have to find a replacement or fix that part. And other times, if it's so severe, we will consider outsourcing components.
So what's the difference between restoring a steam engine to a diesel locomotive?
So it all really depends on whether we're actually going to run it as a runner, an operational locomotive, or as a static display like this one. But in the variations it can vary in both senses, where the expertise required for, let's say, the running gear or the springs or the boiler would be very different to the expertise in regarding making the traction motors and the bogies on a diesel more viable for moving around, especially taking it into the museum and putting it on display.
Are there any restoration projects you're currently working on?
At the moment, we're currently working on a few carriages that have come up in the priority list of what we need to do that we want to put on display within the museum. And they can vary on what type of carriage and where they were used, either from the West Australian Government Railways or the Commonwealth Railways. And so we want to really, through those carriages, show the true story of the state and its connection with the east coast of Australia through the Commonwealth Railways and also the West Australian Government Railways.
When I was walking around through, I noticed there's a period of rail cars which I don't seem to see here, and that's the diesel passenger ones that were on the city lines before the electrics came in. Are there any of them still around?
Yes, there's a few around the state. We have a few in our collection, spread it around. But again, it's a variation of what our priorities are in restoring the diesel rail cars, which some of us would love to do, but we just need to prioritise our time on some of the other more important things that we need to focus on to present to the public the true stories of the history of railways in the state.
Well, thanks Rhys for giving us a look into the workshop side of things. Now, the workshop do amazing behind the scenes stuff, it's incredible. And we can see the results of that by this machine just here, which has just come out from being restored. This locomotive was used at the East Perth Power Station, shunting coal up until about 1969. Now, I found another department that is just as important when it comes to restoring equipment, so they look the way they did when they were in service. In there, I found another Graham, and I asked him what their role was.
Most of the plans, as I mentioned to you previously, are already here. Others come in from donations from other enthusiasts or from deceased estates. And if we go through a process that if the plan, we check it out to see whether we've got it. Obviously it's got to be of Western Australian Railways, and if we've got it, is it in better condition than one of ours? And if it doesn't meet any of those, we can discard it. But if we add it to our collection, then it is catalogued. And it's all been given a reference number, which so we can locate it in our pigeonholes or in our plan cabinets at a later date.
So did you have some kind of background with the railways in the beginning or anything?
No, as I mentioned a moment ago, I was a school teacher.
School teacher. So what made you decide to come over here and volunteer here?
It started off with my interest in model railways, that if you're going to model the railways of Western Australia, you've got to have access to the information. So I joined up and volunteered to take over organising the archives.
So just tell us about what you've got here.
So this is our collection of plans and drawings. There's 3,000 or 4,000 of them. Most of them either been catalogued or audited by Anne, who is sitting over there. She's our plan and drawings expert. Most of them have come from the railways. Some of them were, or many of them were given to us before we'd set up the archives. And some of them, many of them come from around the turn of the previous century. So we don't have that much current stuff with the plans. On this side is what we call our archival documents, with particular note for this particular line here is all our photographic collections, just over 32,000 photos, and we have a hard copy of every photo, and they're all been scanned, captioned, catalogued and safely stored. And we also have a website which has over 30,000 of these photos on our online photo gallery. We get a whole lot of items from deceased estates, and right in front of us is a collection from a deceased estate of the fellow's slide collection, and we figure there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 slides here from his collection, from railways in this particular case from all over the world, but we only keep photographs of the railways of Western Australia.
And if photos aren't enough, there's a full collection of books and magazines, each filled with stories from West Australia's rich rail history. Well done to everyone involved. If it wasn't for people like you, all this history and information could have been lost to time. Well, that brings us to an end to our visit here at the Bassendean Rail Heritage Centre. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here and would really love to thank everybody that's been involved here to help me put this video together. Without that, it wouldn't have been possible. Especially Graham with all his stories he was telling us about all the different engines that are around here. Really worthwhile. And if you are in the area, come on down and have a look around. They could do with you having a look to put some money in the coffers to help pay for everything that goes on around here. Now if you've got a favourite train museum somewhere, or if you've been on a train trip and like to tell us about it, put it down in the comments down below. And if you can help the channel out by giving it a thumbs up, because that'll make YouTube show my videos to more viewers. And if you want to see more of this sort of thing, then hit the subscribe button down the bottom down there, so that you find out next time when I upload a video. But until next time, wherever that may be, happy travels.